Yes, correct.
Hello and welcome to the Gold, Ghosts, and Guns podcast for in 3, 2, 1. Hello and welcome to the Gold, Ghosts, and Guns podcast for August 19th, 2025. My name is Tom Luongo. We have a lot to talk about. It is episode 228, and I have with me today the great pleasure of getting Peter St.Onge back. But before I bring Peter in, if you care about your liberty and the right to control your own future, I need to inform you of something cool. From October 10th to the 12th, Mikhail Thorup, host of the Expat Money Show, is bringing together top experts from around the world for the Expat Money Online Summit, and it's completely free to attend. You'll learn how to legally protect your wealth, secure second residences and citizenships, reduce your tax burden, and own property abroad, all to safeguard your freedom. This year's focus is Latin America, where opportunity is booming. Argentina is shifting to free markets. El Salvador is undergoing a dramatic transformation, and Panama and Paraguay are offering simple residency programs. A Plan B is no longer optional. It's essential. So reserve your free ticket at expatmoneysummit.com. That's expatmoneysummit.com. Peter, how are you?
I am great. It's great to see you again, Tom.
It's funny, I pinged you about 3 weeks ago, right after the EU signed their big trade deal, or the biggest trade deal ever with the United States, and I really appreciated your commentary around that, tariffs, and a variety of other things, because I think that, especially amongst Austrian or Austrian adjacent commentators, you have some of the most balanced commentary on this, and that I've seen, and I'm not sure what I call myself anymore. I think Austrian adjacent is probably the best way for me to describe myself at this point. I think flexible is the better word for it. And so what I really like you to do is to go through what you're seeing on this, like why why Trump has been so successful with tariffs and the leverage he's had in the trade deals and everything else, and how that. And I think eventually we'll get into why we saw what we saw yesterday at the White House. So take it from there.
Yeah, so I think the key on tariffs is that, standard economic theory says that trade is good for both sides, and that's true. However, it is much better for the seller in practice, right? And this is why countries use tariffs. This is why China, for example, has used them for a long time. Europe is interesting because what Europe actually does, the rhetoric around the European Union is that it's this great free trade zone. It's a fortress, and what they do is charge countries to access. So you see this nakedly with like Switzerland, Iceland, Norway, I think for a long time, where they were literally paying to access the European Union. And these were large fees. They were like billions of dollars, several percent of the GDP in these countries. And if they didn't pay those access fees, then they were going to get shut out. Now, this is interesting because Trump is aware of this. And so what he's effectively doing with these trade deals is he's saying to everybody in the world, look, trade is great and all, but I know you guys are making out like bandits. The U.S. is roughly 1/4 of the global economy. For a lot of these countries, places like Vietnam, we are the only game in town. We are the basis of their economy. Something like 1/3 of Vietnam's economy is exporting to the U.S. That gives us a lot of leverage. And so what Trump is doing is effectively monetizing that. He's saying to these countries, you can have access to the U.S., but you're going to have to pay for it. You're going to have to give me a chunk of change. And, for decades, we were lectured by the, economic poobahs that this sort of thing was immoral and that it would never, ever work, right? The other countries would punish us back, and then it would just be, a war of all against war. War of all against all. And guess what? Turns out that's not true. So what these countries are doing is just one after the next, they are bending the knee. And the general pattern now looks like most countries are getting 15% tariffs. We're paying absolutely nothing in exchange. Right? American exports are getting zero tariffed. So they pay 15 for most countries. If they run a trade surplus with us, then that's getting down towards 10. If, on the other hand, they're more or less third world labor platforms for China, then they're getting 20, 19 or 20. So that's places like Indonesia or Vietnam. And on top of that, now these countries are then pouring trillions of dollars into these funds that are going to invest in the U.S. The details on that are not clear, right? So Japan, for example, committed, I think, something like $750 billion that they're going to invest into the U.S. economy. That could go into energy infrastructure, drilling. It could go into manufacturing. Trump has been saying that we're going to get all the profits and we're going to keep control of the money. Japan said, no, that's not our understanding of it. That stuff is going to get worked out. I think there's something, the optimistic view of it is that, we're looking at several $1 trillion coming in because of these sort of side deals on the tariff negotiations. And for perspective, the entire U.S. economy has something like $4 trillion of investment a year. So $2 trillion is a big chunk of change. I think the only caveat that worries me a little bit is that Trump is in love with the idea of a sovereign wealth fund, where the U.S. government owns a whole bunch of assets. He talked about throwing TikTok in there. He's talking about taking a share in Intel and throwing that in there. And, this is something that a lot of countries do. The Gulf states do it. China does it. Singapore does it. Alaska, the state of Alaska, has a sovereign wealth fund that it's not quite sovereign, but it's built off oil revenue. And, I think the concern here, is Trump's not going to be president forever. The next guy who comes in, sooner or later, we're going to have a Democrat in charge. And you can imagine what kind of slush fund that thing is going to turn into. Historically, those things are very corrupt. They get poured into industries that have government connections, industries that literally give politician shares, things like that. So that I'm a little bit concerned how those trillions are going to work out. But if we sort of moving from that onto the blue collar workers who Trump is really targeting here, these things are pretty fantastic, right? They give you an advantage for producing in the U.S. They bring all this investment in. Trump's been strong arming not just countries, but individual companies, forcing them to produce in America. And there he says 8 trillion. I think public numbers are something like 3 trillion. Anyway, these are very large numbers of investment coming into the country. And in general, they're building factories or they're building energy infrastructure, both of which are very good for blue collar jobs.
Yeah, no, I think that's all a really nice summary of it. Interestingly enough, you talk about the company part of it. I wasn't shocked, but I was impressed with the deal that he forced down both NVIDIA and AMD's throat.
Yeah.
And so it's like he just put an export tariff on.
Yeah.
Like it's just crazy, and they ate it.
Yeah.
And and the talking point that I've been running with is in my learning to like wrap my brain around tariffs, because like being in the fully free market mindset for 20 years, it's very difficult to then shift that mode into something else and ask yourself, okay, so why would the tariffs be working? And it became pretty obvious that the way I started to think about it was in terms of gross margins, right? And all Trump is doing is just clawing back excessive gross margins for what amounts to commodity producers. The way I would put it on some of the podcasts I've been on, where I said, look, if you're Nike and you're doing all the R&D and the development work and the design work on Air Jordans, you have every right to charge $200, $250 for your sneakers because they're exclusive and you get access to them and blah, 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 and you do the design work, and you're going to charge 35, 40% gross margins on those things. If you're the Indian knockoff company or the Chinese knockoff company making Air Jordans, well, then, you don't get 40% gross margins. But these non-tariff barriers that you described were enforcing that. And so what did Trump do? He said, yeah, I'm going to find out where your pain point is.
Yeah.
And then I'm going to drop your gross margins back to 6, 7, 8%, which is where they belong. And the proof in that pudding was, for me, I live rural, so I buy almost everything I can on Amazon because it's cheaper for me to pay the basically the embedded delivery fee in Amazon Prime than it is for me to drive 20 miles to go to freaking Walmart. Like, it's 67 and 70 cents a mile. That's an expensive trip right? So better to just have UPS and Amazon deliver their stuff to me. And since we have a distribution center about 7 miles outside of town, it's actually much cheaper for Amazon in the end for them to send everything to me. And my point here is that what I've noticed is that all the cheap Chinese crap that I need, USB-C cables and this and that, little things that you buy on Amazon all the time for 25 or 30 bucks or $7 or whatever, are exactly the same price that they were last year.
Yeah. Yeah.
After the tariffs went in place.
Yeah. And that's what happens typically with tariffs, is that initially the companies are going to eat it, because if, USB cables is a very, very competitive industry, right? It's got tiny margins.
Right.
If you're producing a bunch of stuff in China and you get a 15% tariff, you can't raise your price 15%. You're going to price yourself out of the market. And so what they're going to do instead is they may not bump the price at all. In the short run, they won't, okay, because they want to try to hold on to market share. And what they'll do instead is they'll try to cut costs back home, or they'll raise prices somewhere else, try to make up the difference. Maybe they'll raise prices in China. So they play with the numbers, because fundamentally they're trying to maintain market share. The only way that a tariff is going to get 100% passed on is if the tariff is on every single producer, including the American producers. That will get 100% passed on, right? And so that then brings the other point, right, which is that in the short run, companies are going to eat the tariffs. And we saw that, for example, with Japanese car prices, that they declined in lockstep with the percent that Trump was putting on the tariffs, because they're trying to maintain their market share. Now, they do that in the short run while they sort of stand back and see, are the tariffs going to last? Is there something else we can do? Can we cut costs somewhere? Can we change the mix of cars that we're exporting so that we can still keep the same amount of profits coming in? So they're going to, sort of go through that back and forth negotiation. And then that brings us to the long term. In the long term, the question is going to be, how do they adjust all those? And the most important, was it possible to bring any of the production into the US? Right. So if you're a Chinese company, you don't care where you produce. You're happy to produce in the US. You really don't care. And we know this because they've all been moving to Vietnam to try to dodge Trump's tariffs back in 2018. Mm-hmm. So they are not nationalists. Great. They love money just like American companies do. Right? American companies will sell our country down the river for $1, and guess what? Chinese will too. Right. So a lot of those guys, they are right now sitting in their boardrooms and they're asking, well, can we make this crap in Arizona? If they can, they're going to move. And then the tariffs disappear. They don't have to pay them anymore. And in fact, at that point, they can undercut all of their competitors who they're trying to eat for lunch. Mm-hmm. So either way, the entire amount of the tariffs are not going to pass through. Some of it is going to be replaced with domestic production. Some of that domestic production is going to be Chinese companies. But for now, in the near term, the Fed is using tariffs as its main excuse to keep rates high. If we look back at what happened in 2018, almost none of the tariffs passed through. Either companies ate them, or specifically in the case of China, the Chinese government wrote a check to companies that were impacted by tariffs in order to help them get through it. So in other words, China was paying for the tariffs, like the Chinese government, which is pretty cool.
Well, and what's funny is you bring up the Fed rate using the excuse. I think what the Fed was actually, this gets into my argument about the Fed, that Powell's keeping interest rates high because Trump hadn't finished a trade deal with the European Union yet. He hadn't, that was on July 28th. And on June 16th, which is the FOMC meeting before that, we were right in the middle of the 12-day war between Israel and Iran. Yeah. Like, if I'm Jerome Powell, I'm not cutting rates in the environment either. Like, the way I looked at it was really simple. Powell's like, Trump, all this sounds great. Show me. Mm-hmm. Like, Powell may not be from Missouri. He may be eighth generation Virginian, but, for the last few months, show me. And then, of course, we had, I just found it all really funny, like with all the BLS stuff. Like, during the Biden administration, they were cooking the books high in order to try and get Kamala Harris elected. So Powell was like, well, the labor market's great, can't cut rates. And then in Trump's administration, they're like revising everything down. Now the labor market's terrible to try and make Trump look bad. And Powell's like, well, guess I'm going to have to cut rates soon.
Yeah.
And you can see how this is all kind of played itself out. You eventually, one of Donald Trump's superpowers, if not his ultimate superpower, is that he's able to expose everybody's weakness and pain point.
Yes.
And he's so good at it, including, to a lesser extent, Jerome Powell's. But frankly, even Jerome Powell has, he's just been doing the exact same thing, but on the monetary policy part of the stage. And then he's going to exit the scene soon. And as long as, we're not showing huge inflation, and I'll be honest with you, like the whole 2% inflation target, we're still above target. Like, that's nonsense. Powell was never down with the 2% inflation target when Bernanke, unilaterally imposed it on the Fed back in 2007 in the first place.
Yeah.
I mean, that's documented by Danielle DiMartino Booth in her book on this stuff. Like, so it's like none of this, all of this just feels like this, it's still just kind of theater. But the reality is that, as always, Donald Trump, who has negotiated deals that, all of these midwits have never had to, he's just knocking them down one by one because he knows exactly where their pain is.
Yeah, he absolutely has. And, I think part of what's driving Powell is that Powell is trying to influence policy, right? It's not just that he's afraid of tariffs. He's essentially telling Trump, nice economy you got here. If you get rid of the tariffs, then I can help you out. And, this is in contrast to what the Fed usually does, right? Usually, whenever the central government does anything that's going to cause economic damage, the Fed jumps in to help with the fallout, right? It does this every time we have a war. It does this with, 2008. It does this every single recession. The Fed normally does not stand there and say, well, you guys made your bed. You have to lay in it, right? Only now does the Fed have spine. Now, that could be because Jerome Powell's only got, 7 months or 9 months left. And he's got to think about his career after that. And, the deep state, the world he's going to go into after he finishes his term is going to be one that pays you $250,000 for a speech from hedge funds, right? This is a very left-wing world. It's a very deep state aligned world because they're trying to satisfy their regulators. Finance is really just an arm of the government at this point. Jerome Powell is going to be entering that world, and that world hates Trump. And they specifically hate the tariffs. And so if he can be the man on the wall fighting back against tariffs, this is going to be very good for his speaking fees and for his future employment prospects. But that's not what the Fed's supposed to be, right? The Fed is not supposed to be an unelected Jedi council that is running our country as a dictatorship in opposition to the democratically elected president. But here we are. And, you can say the same for the BLS, right? Where, the revisions go one way when the president's Democrat and another when it's Republican.
But the thing is, I get that. I get that angle on it, but I keep going back to, Powell, private equity Powell, which is what his nickname used to be, is the guy who, none of his private equity friends can get him on the phone while he was raising rates in 2022 and 2023. So I think it's a mixture of both here. I think there's maybe a little bit of that, but I think that Powell's using boilerplate speech to do what he wanted to do in the first place.
Yeah.
Always wanted to do, which was, look, let's just see if Trump can pull all this off and then use whatever excuse is handy at the time to do exactly what he thinks is the right thing to do, which is, is to not cut rates and into the summer of turmoil. Now, that being said, think about what he did last year. Everybody said that he should have cut in July, right? 25 basis points in July. And everybody was outraged that he didn't do so. Of course, that's because they were hoping that they can get the Fed to cut rates and then they can boost the stock market and try and make it easier for Kamala Harris to win re-election. And then he cuts 50 basis points in September. Now, Trump is no dummy. He knows full well that the Fed not starting to cut rates 6 weeks before the election is not going to affect the outcome of the election at all because the economy is not going to respond to a 50 basis point cut in that 6 week time period. Or did we all forget our Keynesian talking point that it takes 6 to 9 months for a change in monetary policy to filter its way through the economy and actually affect voters, not Wall Street, but voters. And that's what happened. So he cuts in 50 because by that point, there was enough pain in the credit markets that he needed to do so. And then he cuts 50, 25, 25, waits for Trump to come to office. And I think he's going to do the exact same thing for the rest of the year, 50 in September after Jackson Hole, and then 25. I may be wrong about that, but that's my base case for this point in time, because he's late by a rate cut now. The labor market is now, we now have the data that the labor market's rolling over. The credit markets are stressed. Delinquencies are up, blah, 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 blah. Now it's perfect time to cut interest rates. We get all this extra money coming in. Because remember, the other thing that Powell did during the Biden administration was he was sharply critical of fiscal policy, which a Fed chair has never, not even Volcker, was critical of fiscal policy. So, I mean, openly, repeatedly critical of fiscal policy, saying, look, if you guys aren't going to stop spending, I'm not cutting rates. I'm going to keep raising rates. And that's what he did. He followed through on it. He's been very clear on that. So Trump cut spending, and I'll cut rates. And then, and you've got tariff revenue coming in. Great. You've got all this other revenue coming in. Great. The books are getting balanced. And Scott Bessent is out there doing a little bit of treasury-based yield curve control, which is also necessary. But really what he's doing is he's just retiring old high. He's just offering to buy back the high interest rate at 80 cents on the dollar and retiring obligations that way. That's what he's doing. So
I would love for Powell to be a closet Volcker in that narrative. I think there's 2 points there that I would disagree with. So one was he very lightly criticized Joe Biden. It was uncharacteristic for a Fed chair, it's true. But, he did a standard roundabout. I don't remember the exact phrasing, but it was very light criticism. Moreover, if he's worried about spending, if Jerome Powell is really, kind of a closet hard money guy, if we look at spending, so in Joe Biden's last budget, he tried to hike spending by $800 billion. All right. If we look at actual spending right now, we're about $400 billion over last year. Yeah, we're $400 billion over last year. But once you strip out, like most of that is on autopilot, right? You've got about 100 coming out of Social Security. You got 150 coming out of Medicaid and Medicare. You got 80 coming out of debt interest, which is, that's because Yellen, not Yellen, actually Powell, right, was using, short bills and not long bills. But at any rate, so, roughly, what are you left with? About $66 billion in additional spending on, the remaining $2 trillion out of the budget. But inflation over that period was 2.7%. So you strip that out and you're down to $17 billion. $17 billion is what Trump has grown the federal government by compared to a year ago. Now, compare that to Joe Biden trying to bump it 800, which if you do the same strip outs, that's not 17, that's 417, right? So Trump is light years ahead of Biden in terms of fiscal restraint. I attack the Republicans, of course, because they've been promising for years that they're going to cut, and they didn't cut. They increased a little bit. But, in terms of like whether, is Powell fighting the good fight against a spendy Trump? Things are much, much better than they were under Powell. I think, between sort of Powell putting the pressure on to keep spending low, that one, narrative, versus the narrative Powell is trying to put the pressure on in order, partly just to sort of cancel his image as, the author of this terrible inflation, but possibly for the tariffs to try to put pressure on Trump. I think that's probably more likely.
Yeah, I that's all fair, but there's always, as always, I'm not going to gish gallop here, though it will feel like it. But you got to remember that there's also the Eurodollar system that he's also working. He's working that angle on as well.
Yes,
and I think that's the bigger role here. This is one of the things that I have been, trying to take the totality of what I'm seeing, the stablecoin bills, everything. I mean, I've talked about this in other podcasts. We've talked about it on other episodes with other people, and I haven't talked about it with you, but it's like, look, you have to drain the leverage out of the Eurodollar system if you're going to then start to drain, the NGO money and everything else that's being used as basically a slush fund to keep old Europe alive and to keep the Eurodollar system vibrant and capable of instantiating a color revolution here in the United States, which they've worked very, very assiduously to try and pull off and have failed miserably. And I have some interesting color on that I've been told about this.
They have a color revolution running as we speak in Serbia right now, so they're definitely alive and kicking despite despite Doge.
Sure. Yeah, but the point of that is that the first thing you've got to kind of do is like set the market and set the period where we can raise interest rates. SOFR is running, LIBOR is not setting the price of international dollars. All of that stuff is happening, and we have to continue to keep the pressure on until we can get all the other things taken care of. So a trade deal with the European Union. That's point number one. What we've now seeing over the last 4 or 5 days between Putin coming to Anchorage and then everybody else being summoned to the White House and trying to schmooze Trump and failing miserably, in my estimation. Like the stage is set for Powell to then change the narrative around monetary policy. But at the same time, Peter, and this is like should be music to every Austrian's ears, it's very clear that they're going to reform the Fed. And that I just think Powell's a scapegoat for it because he happens to be the guy in office right now. And that's fine. And, Trump was never kind of happy with Powell, but that's because Trump thinks he can just grow his way out of the problem. But unfortunately, you have an institutional inertia within the global financial community, which won't necessarily allow that to happen as long as Trump doesn't have, in his first term, Trump didn't have the political control that he needed in order to affect what he needed to do. So the first thing to do is get control of the monetary policy, then allow the system to run its course. And then, in the second term, like Powell's going to be a little slow to the party. That's okay. The United States, what he's really saying is that the United States economy can handle 4.5% far better than everybody else can, which is why everybody else is cutting and he's not.
Yeah.
And if you want to talk out of both sides of your mouth, Donald Trump, and say the economy is the greatest ever and yada, 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 well, that doesn't. Good economies don't go along with low interest rates. Good economies go along with raising interest rates in the Keynesian model of the world. Now, if we're going to change the model, great. But as of right now, you've got a Fed that is overwhelmingly Democrat, and the culture within the Fed is also something that Powell has to fight. Ultimately, at the end of the day, and this is where I get it. I've had these arguments with other people on this. The chairman is in control of interest rates, and pretty much nothing else. Ultimately, yes, he sets the agenda and everything else, but the individual, the 12 regional banks still have their, fiefdoms and everything else. The Fed's not a monolith,
right?
It's a mess. And it needs to be broken down. No argument here that it needs to be broken down. It needs to be reformed. And I think that what Trump is doing is using this fight with Powell as a means by which to set that narrative for the people, unlike us, who have no clue as to what the Fed actually does or even that it even exists.
Yeah.
And you start that by going after Powell because he's an easy target.
Yeah, I think
that's the way I.
Yeah. There was a poll recently. Something like 90% of Americans say that they have no idea what the Fed does, and which is a problem, right? Because not only is it undemocratic, but you don't even have voter feedback, and people have no idea what it does. And of course, most people, their main contact with the Fed is reading newspaper articles about the Fed fighting inflation. So they would conclude that what the Fed does is fights inflation. Of course, that's the precise opposite of what a central bank is. It is literally right. The deal is you guys can counterfeit money, and in exchange you have to finance government debt. This is the classic, going back 500 years. It is literally an inflation machine. I think you're absolutely right that Trump wants to fundamentally change the Fed. The question is that going to be a structural change, or is that just going to be turning the Fed into his bitch, where every president from now on is going to say this is what interest rates are going to be, and then the Fed's going to say yes, sir. And I mean, ideally, I'm kind of okay with that. The academic research says that independent central banks control inflation better. However, there's a big caveat, which is that the vast majority, something like 70% of that research, is funded by central banks. So what do you think they're going to say?
Well, it's the other thing is that they're all. I mean, this is where my where my my deep dive into Austrian economics years ago led me, which is that, look, at the end of the day, and this is where you get into stuff with, the stuff, all the work that like people like Walter Block and Gary North and a couple of others did for years, when they said, look, we don't even live in a Keynesian world anymore. Keynes would be rolling over in his grave if he saw what these people were doing. We live in a in effect, Samuelsonian world, where Paul Samuelson's textbook was the college textbook on how to run macroeconomics for over 2 generations. And so everybody's trained in this mindset, including all of the staff economists at the Fed. And so, yes, there's normalcy bias, there's confirmation bias within all that research. These aren't research papers, these are position papers. You kind of have to look at it as kind of like Oppo research more than it is anything else. So at the end of the day, if you've got, Powell was installed by Wall Street. He was recommended to Trump by Wall Street in 2017. Trump had no idea who he was.
Right. Yeah.
And they just, they came in, Mnuchin and company, they said, this is our guy, this is who we want. And then the first thing he does is he starts the transition from LIBOR to SOFR. And, the more I've been thinking about this, the more it's pretty obvious that Wall Street set this in motion and then left Trump to be their basically their distraction, while they were running the operation behind the scenes to fundamentally change the rules of how we're going to do business. And that needed to change first before we can get the political change that would be durable. And that process sadly just takes time.
Yeah.
And then we had COVID, which was a clear counter attack against all of this and left Powell with, a damaged reputation and blah, 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 blah. So there's a you're absolutely correct in invoking the political angle on the Fed in this discussion. The question is, to what angle do you have to take on politics in order to figure out, why we're even where we are.
Yeah.
Because where we are is in a far better place than where we would have been had there not been the opportunity to do what we're doing now. I just think Trump's first term was an opportunity to change the nature of the game board.
Yeah.
And it's taken 8 years for it to play itself out. And now Powell can leave the scene, I think, with his head held high, with handing off the situation to Bessent and Trump to reform the Fed. And he probably knows better than anybody else what needs to be reformed. That's my take on the situation. I may be wrong about that. He may be fully institutionally captured, as Scott Bessent has alluded to, but I don't think so.
Yeah, you and I probably differ on Powell. I think sort of his biggest mistake was writing a blank check during COVID. The Fed financed all those. I think people like you or I were sitting around in COVID and we were like, how in the hell are the American people putting up with this? With the lockdowns, destroying small business, destroying jobs, overwhelmingly blue collar jobs. And of course, the reason they put up with it was because the Fed wrote I think it was a $6 trillion check at one point. In terms of increase in the money supply. I think the Fed's balance sheet itself was up something like $5 trillion. Right. So in other words, that's money that they printed, they flooded out into the market, and that's what financed, people sitting on couch. You do that to 10, 20% of the voters, and what do you know, you're going to swing it. And so I think that in a sense, if Powell hadn't done that, no other country would have had the confidence to do that because they would have been the dirtiest shirt in the laundry basket. So, I mean, for me anyway, like in terms of Powell's legacy, I think that's pretty much... Maybe it's not quite as bad as Arthur Burns, but it's definitely up there.
Well, okay. And again, I will push back on that and say that it's also Trump's biggest mistake for signing the CARES Act in the first place, which then created it. Which, so it's like Powell held out until Trump signed the CARES Act.
Yeah.
If you go back over it, he didn't throw the money out there until Trump signed the CARES Act, which Pelosi browbeat him into signing because they had, because Trump at that point he was a mess. And again, the Federal Reserve ultimately has been tasked since the Banking Act in 1935 with backstopping the U.S. Treasury market. Yep. Now that is a problem, but it is also the Fed's mandate, right? So like it or not, he didn't really have a choice because Congress told him he didn't have a choice. If we had the 1913 Fed, which was only there to support the commercial paper market, maybe Powell would have been able to hang out. So again, the holdout. Again, it's like everything else. You know, there is a nuanced reality to the situation. And look, if I'm Jerome Powell and the entire world is saying, look, this is what's going to happen and we're going to destroy this, like, okay, fine, this is what you want. You can get everything you want. You're not going to be very happy about it in the end, because when it's all said and done, I'm going to yank all that money back. To Powell's credit, the Fed's balance sheet now is lower by a significant amount under what it was pre-COVID. Powell has reduced the Fed's balance sheet.
No, it's a mile.
Yeah, no, it hit below $6 trillion.
No, let me pull up the numbers. All right, wait a minute. Okay,
that hit the newswire 3 or 4 months ago. That's old data.
No way. All right, wait a minute. Why am I in All right, Fred, let's see. Balance sheet. Total assets, less eliminations. All right, we're at 6.6 at the moment. We were at 4.1 pre-COVID.
We were at 6.2 at one point. So whether the Fed has added to the balance sheet in recent times, but
no. All right. So pre-COVID. Let's see. I don't know. Let's call it pre-COVID. The last day of 2019, it was 4.2. Then the Fed took it to 8.9, and now they've QT'd it down to 6.6. We're still light years ahead. Yes, he's made progress. QT I think has been better. It's been at a faster pace than I think a lot of us expected. I figured it was just going to be lip service, that they weren't actually going to drain very much. He has drained, 2.3 trillion. But they've got, 2.2 trillion in cash saved up. And that's actually topical, because that's one of the things that I think Kevin Warsh has been talking about, where if the Fed comes in with the new chair and slashes rates, normally, as you know, that would set off inflation. You mentioned earlier, you've got the lag, might be as much as 12 to 18 months, but normally slashing rate, if he cuts off like 200 basis points, I think Trump at one point said 300 basis points is what he wants as a cut.
Which was insane.
But, that's also how Trump talks. This could be unbelievable.
Right. It's a Zopa thing with him, right?
But at any rate, what's interesting coming out of Warsh is that if they cut really hard like that, the idea is that they can just crank up QT, so they can cancel out the low rates. And so the way he characterizes it as is Robin Hood. So, Main Street gets lower rates, mortgage rates, credit cards, and so on. But Wall Street takes a haircut on that stash of bonds that the Fed bought up.
Fair enough. I'm okay with that. And if that's Kevin Warsh's analysis, I'll agree with it.
Yeah,
I'm okay with that. Let's go back to more QT.
Yeah, but of course, at some point they ran a QT, right? And so kind of the punchline on that is that could buy Trump 3 years of slashing rates with no inflation, but whoever's coming next is going to get slammed.
Well, yeah. I mean, again, it depends on how we're dealing with the way the government's being funded as well, of course. Because remember, we're not dealing with massive deficits. We're not dealing with budget. If we're dealing with a fiscal house that's in order, and now let's go back to the tariff revenue. Now we're talking about the boomers aging out, so Social Security and Medicare costs are already starting to fall off. I mean, this is a process which, over that 3-year time span, $30 to $40 billion a month in tariff revenues all of a sudden changes the nature of that beast, tremendously. And that's just the beginning of it. Clearly, what Trump wants to do is to grow his way out of this and to accept the existing inflation as wrote, where this is where we are. We're not going back to pre-COVID pricing levels on anything. And then we go from there. So that's clearly their plan.
Yeah, I agree. And that's really the big game. And it's the biggest game, right? So we are an unsustainable fiscal path. What we learned this year, when you take the GOP sweep in Washington, right? So we had GOP control of everything, including the Supreme Court. And we had Elon Musk, who he's a force of nature, right? So you put Doge together with the GOP, and we should have had massive cuts in spending, which the GOP has been promising for 75 years. And instead, we had 17 billion jump. Okay, it's not that bad, but compared to, we had the perfect storm. Trump, for all of the attacks he gets on spending, every single budget in his first term, he proposed huge cuts. They were like 150, 200 billion, which was a lot of money back then. Every time Congress said no. So Trump is constitutionally opposed to spending. He has tried to cut spending over and over. You had Doge, you had GOP sweep, and nothing. And that, to me, right, I think that's a big reason why gold took off and Bitcoin as well, is that like once, you have like a natural experiment. Is it possible if we just vote the right guys into office, can we cut spending? And now we know the answer to that natural experiment. Absolutely not. There is no way to fix it. The only way that we're ever going to cut spending is that we got to hit the crisis. And I mean, you would need Democrats to wake up tomorrow and agree to a balanced budget amendment in order to head this thing off. Maybe Warren Buffett, he's got a suggestion where he says if Congress can't balance the budget, they all have to resign with a lifetime ban from politics. That would work, but that ain't happening. So realistically, we are 100% headed off the cliff. The only question is how long is it going to take? And that's fascinating from an investment perspective, right? You can continue on, let's say, equities for a long time, right? Like if the end of the game is coming in 2040, who cares right now, right? You can literally sell your NVIDIA tomorrow, okay? Your horizon is not 15 years. Your horizon is like this year for tax purposes or whatever. So, sort of the background here is that, yes, we can continue making money. Guys like Peter Schiff, who taught, the sky's always falling next Tuesday. You're going to lose a lot of money, in my opinion, with guys like that. I love Peter Schiff, but from an investment perspective, the guy's toxic. He will destroy your life savings. But in terms of, for investment strategy, we are headed off the cliff. It's probably going to take a long time because they're going to move heaven and earth. They're going to monetize everything they can. They're going to find sneaky ways to tax us. They're going to let inflation roll. Early in Biden inflation, Powell was talking about a 3% target, right, which would massively ramp up the effective inflation tax. There's a lot of ways, there's a lot of contingency tools that they have, to stretch it out. So like the end's not coming in 3 years or anything. You can still make money as it is. But I think sort of as a background investment thesis, there is nothing stopping this train.
Well, okay. I don't buy that argument ultimately, because I think that there's I get it, and I'm not saying that I'm not hedged for it. I'm not saying that I don't have my people from an investment perspective not prepared for it. We were in Bitcoin at $8,800 for Christ's sake. The same thing with gold. It's called gold, goats, and guns for a reason, right? But when I think about all of this, the focus on debt is one side of it. And what I've been exploring is, what do we do with the asset side of the balance sheet?
Yeah.
Okay. When you look at the country and you only focus on one side of it, deficits, debt, this, that, everything else, fine. Okay. But what do you do? What do you do when you've got assets that you've written to zero? Because you've hived them off from environmental policy, or you've done this, or you've done that, and all the regulatory scheme that has brought us to this perilous point. I'll be honest with you, Peter. I've been, I do this because this is what I do, which is to think about the recent history or think about a current situation and then reframe it.
Yeah.
Right. Let's reframe the last 17 years post 2008 as the Great Depression. Let's reframe it that way. It doesn't feel like the Great Depression because ultimately they papered it over and we lived off of the last bit of the savings. But look at where we are culturally, the border, the this, the that, the invasion, all of this stuff. I think we've already hit rock bottom as a people. And now this is the statement of, we cannot go any farther. We now need to we need to get rid of all of these first world problems like CO2 is a pollutant and a poison and all of this. And none of this stuff matters anymore. What matters is what I watched a 3-minute video of I tweeted it out last night of Mike Rowe talking about the absolute need for 150,000 electricians and welders to build submarines.
Yeah.
Can you get them to me tomorrow? Right. 500,000 electricians, that kind of thing. And when asked about it, goes like, where are you going to get those people? Where are they? And Mike's like, they're 8 years old.
Yeah.
That's where they are. Yeah. So what do you do between now and then? Like, and I got news for you. Like, if Mike Rowe ran our economic policy, we'd probably be in a better state.
Oh yeah.
Um, so but clearly the other side of what Trump and Bessent and everybody have been talking about is what do we do with the assets that have been written to zero on the balance sheet?
Yeah.
And how do we unlock those to change the book value of the United States and then use that as a means by which to attract investment? And I think that what you alluded to, what you talked about in the trade deals and the investment that Trump has brought in, I think that's part of the key. And then everything else is happening on the regulatory side as well.
Yeah, I think you're absolutely right. And that's a big reason why I've been optimistic. It's one reason I'm optimistic on tariffs, right? Because some of that is going to be replaced domestically. And, earlier I was saying it's the big game, right? Meaning that on the one hand, you've got this giant boulder of debt, and the debt's been growing and there's no end to it. But the other hand, exactly what you're saying, that the mere fact that the American people elected Trump twice, right, against, everything was arrayed against him. And you could say the first time was a fluke, but the second time they went even harder, and, twice is not what is it? Enemy action, right? The fact they did it twice, right. Americans intentionally elected this guy to shake up the entire system. And, when you look at crises, the concern is always that people will fix things in a crisis, right? 1991 Soviet Union, they fixed it, right? Russia today is much better than it was in 1990, despite the war. But what you hope is that you can get that without a major crisis. The ideal is that you might get it with a little mini crisis, that people might get upset. In the 1970s, we saw this, right? So the 1970s were not the Great Depression. They were not the end of the Republic. They were not 1990 Soviet Union. They were bad.
Right.
Public safety, inflation, joblessness hit, I think, 10, 12%, maybe 14. They were bad, but they were just bad enough. It was like falling off a cliff and then hitting a ledge, 12 feet down. It's going to hurt. Right. But you're not dead yet, okay? And maybe at that point, you can start asking whether you should keep walking off that cliff. And you could argue that that's exactly what happened, because of 2008, and then you had Obama. Obama in 2008 looks a lot like the 1970s, right? You had this kind of precipitating economic crisis, and then you had this goofball who made a lot of things worse. And of course, Obama led into Trump, and then now, Biden, bless Biden, he was like Jimmy Carter on steroids. I mean, he ticked every single box. We even got the inflation. It was perfect. It's like God himself reached down and gave us a Jimmy Carter repeat so we could get a Reagan moment. So, right. But yeah, I think you're absolutely right. And, Bessent's talked about how we need 6% growth so we can grow out of the debt, which is interesting because that shifts the narrative, right? That's shifting the narrative to growing the pie now. Now, a pessimist could say, okay, well, Bessent now understands that we're not going to cut spending, and so that ship has sailed, so now we move on to the other part. But as you say, growing the pie is the more important part. Our national debt is not that big if we increase GDP by, say, 1% a year, right? Compounded over 30 years, we actually start outgrowing the debt at some point. And the reason why it's the great game for Trump is that, yes, he's got this existential debt. And Trump is saying, you know what? I'm actually going to do it. Screw it. I'm going to go for the 6% growth. I want America to grow like Singapore. He's doing that with the tariffs. He's doing the mass repeal of regulation. There's a DOGE tool that's supposed to be cutting 50% of regulation, something like 100,000 regulations. That'd be massive, especially for small business, because regulations hit small businesses much harder. If you go to a small town America today, it used to be a little mom and pop, bed and breakfast, a little general store, a little restaurants. Now it's like a Burger King and a gas station. That's regulations, right? So, Trump he's actually going for it to try to grow us fast enough that we could grow out of the debt. If that's the case, it's going to be incredible for asset prices. It's going to be incredible for blue collar wages, really across the board.
It's going to be. Honestly, Peter, I think his sights are even bigger than that, and this gets me into what I'm thinking about in terms of his bringing Fannie and Freddie out of conservatorship. There's so many pieces to this that, I look at it all and I'm like, I know what he's trying to do. He's trying to free up the cash flow of the middle class who've been burdened with this insane level of taxation and debt. And that's why he keeps talking about, well, let's just get rid of income tax for everybody making under 150 grand a year. They don't pay any income. They don't pay the lion's share of income taxes anyway. Mm-hmm. Like they don't, right? So, and then, and what has inflation done but crept up the tax brackets so that the tax brackets don't grow at the same rate that inflation does. So, a larger percentage of the taxes fall on the middle class. And this is all designed. Every bit of this is designed. And this is why that meeting in Washington yesterday was so important, because those are the people that gave us that system. Mm-hmm. And Trump just told them off. I mean, I hate to be I know I don't really hate to be blunt, but like the point is that that's a system that we didn't sign off on as people. We were bribed into it because of Fed policy and deficit spending and Triffin's dilemma and all of this stuff. But we didn't benefit ultimately in the long run for it. We have a GDP that is nice in nominal terms and terrible in real terms, meaning it's not building real wealth for American people. So one of the things that came out of the podcast, a recent podcast I did with Caitlin Long, also in this hive mind of quasi-libertarian thinking on this, is that one of the points that she made when we were talking about stable coins and the Genius Act and all of that, she reminded us that 70% of the credit in the United States, even today, is generated by small and regional banks. They're the ones building the libraries and the strip malls and the this and the that and the acupuncturists and the small office spaces and all the rest of it. That's not J.P. Morgan. Mm-hmm. And those banks need to not be competing with J.P. Morgan for car loans. Yeah. Right. BOFA shouldn't be in the car loan industry. The small banks should be in the car loan industry. And that's part of the end run that the Stablecoin Act can set in motion, which is a return of the means by which all of this investment money comes in and gets flooded into the local markets, because these banks can now in effect directly monetize their reserves and do the end run around the Fed by now having a transmission system that runs through the Treasury and their own reserves. And we get back in a nascent sense, if you start to think about it, back to a much more free banking model that built the country post Reconstruction or post Andrew Jackson's getting rid of the second bank of the United States, which is, that's another angle on this. And so I think all of those things are what's in play. And I know, having talked to people that are in OMB, that is the fucking plan, is they have a problem with this Congress. This Congress was designed Trump won in a landslide and should have had a 40-seat durable majority in the House and an 8-seat or 9-seat majority in the Senate. He should have had that political revolution, and they stole those seats. Okay. It was clear from like the minute they tried to shoot him and he survived, that now the goal was, how do we steal all the down ballots, which made no sense statistically? How do we do this such that we leave him with a compromised Congress? Why I think Trump is working the political angle so hard is to get to the midterms and have that revolution happen in Congress. And then we're going to see the Congress that does what you just said can't be done, which is to actually get the durable spending cuts through a different Congress. Right.
I hope,
because what
right.
we have now is we still have enough holdovers within the old system, the McConnells and the Schumers and the Thunes and the this one and that one. And those people all need to go away, and they're all starting to age out. Yeah. And some of them are going to wind up, getting subpoenas. I think whether they go to jail or not is a different story, but just the threat of the subpoena alone is enough to get them, to start playing ball.
Yeah. I mean, I hope you're right. Trump certainly seems to be abnormally focused on the midterms. Most presidents just kind of do whatever they're going to do early on. Bill Clinton, his big thing was school uniforms. If you were around at the time, I mean, it was just goofy crap.
I was.
Yeah. And, but Trump seems very, very tactically interested in the midterms. He seems to think that they can expand in midterms. Historically, the ruling party does worse in midterms. But he seems to think that they've got a chance. He just put this thing out on the mail-in ballots. Right. So he's very he does seem to have plans for the midterm and, to be hoping that maybe he can get a lot more in. I think during one big, beautiful during the big beautiful bill, I, like many of us on the right, were attacking it because I wanted it to be more aggressive. Trump was defending it, but I completely understood what he was doing at the time. Like, I never went after him for defending it. I was like, yes, no, I understand. You got to go to war with the army you have. Trump's got to say certain things. He's got to keep certain relationships. But that puts in an interesting frame if, as you say, if he's basically just trying to do a placeholder at the moment because the congressional majorities are so thin, and then what he's hoping for is that they can do a landslide during the midterms. But it is striking, the gerrymandering that Democrats do against Republicans is at this point famous. Even in the Senate, something like 1 out of 5 Democrat seats are in red states. A single Republican seat is in a blue state, meaning a state that Kamala won. So, I mean, that's a 7-seat swing in the Senate, which is much less gameable, right? With, the House, you can gerrymander. So, yeah, I think without a doubt, just to put it in perspective, if every state fully gerrymandered, just kind of get a sense of like what the country sort of should look like, it would be something like 40 to 50 seats that would swing to Republicans. So that's seven in the Senate, 50 in the House. They would have been able to cut a massive amount in one big beautiful if they had those kinds of margins.
No, it's agreed. And this is the part that is clear, which is that we've been gaslit into believing that this is a 49-51 country, and it's not.
Right.
It's a 60-40 country.
Yeah. It's
a 60-40 country, and the rest of it is all just nonsense. And inflated voter rolls, cheating, this, that, and everything else. A lot of us want to believe that our system is, that there's a natural kind of 0.5% or 1% corruption within our electoral system, which is that's just human nature, is the way it is. I'm okay with that. It's not. It's like 7%.
Yeah.
I mean, it's an enormous number, and you look. And then when you do that, and when you finally really understand that, and then you look across the pond at Europe and you look at the way they run their elections over there, you realize it's the exact same playbook. It's the exact same game that they play. It's just tuned for a parliamentary system. They do the same thing here. And they're making noise about wanting to recensus, to redo the census, to redo this, to redo all of these things. And the point of all of that is to say our elections, even if we clean them up, are still
dirty,
terminally corrupted. Yeah. And we have a lot of work to do. And so then the question is, okay, well, if that's a problem, that's not going to change anything. And this is the problem. How do you actually get to the midterms where you can get any of this stuff that you want to get done?
Yeah.
Enter DNI Gabbard. And she's the one putting the manila envelopes on the very important desks of the very important people around the world, which is giving Trump the leverage to come in and cut the trade deals that he is and get things passed, because he shouldn't have gotten the one big beautiful bill passed.
Yeah. Yeah.
It should not have passed. He does not have a real majority in the House. He does not have a real majority in the Senate. He has nominal majorities in both in the legislature. What he has is a bunch of people who will say they'll back him because they're nominally Republicans, but what they're actually asking for is more war in Ukraine, or more this, or more this, or more that. What are you going to give me for that? Because they have enough leverage over him because the majorities are so thin, because they stole so many friggin' seats in the 2024 election. And I'm going to my grave on this one, folks. I know I'm right about this. This is not conspiracy. This is just basic electoral friggin' statistics that have made no sense since 2018 at all.
Yeah, there's a fascinating dynamic. All right, so many countries in the world cheat on elections. Right? It's a permanent temptation of democracy, whether you're in Latin America, whether you're in Africa, whether you're in Europe. And the pattern is fascinating. Once a party starts cheating, right, the key to any political party is that it is a permanent civil war between its voters and its special interests, right? So the voters want, whatever Republicans or Democrats are selling, so let's call it Democrats, they want a good life in New York City and Detroit, and for, public safety, this, that, okay. And the special interests, of course, have other ideas how to use that money, or, sometimes they actively. So anyway, it's a permanent civil war. And so what happens is that once a party, like in Mexico or something, once it starts cheating outright, the party goes insane. Because what happens is, at that point, it doesn't have to, right? It can ignore the other side's voters, which is the whole point, but it can also ignore its own voters. And so in that permanent civil war, the special interests get the upper hand. Next thing you know, it does absolutely crazy things. For example, defunding the police in black neighborhoods where blacks are the overwhelming majority of crime in the US. Massive. Whatever the commit rate is, the victim rate is similar. All right. Massive. Men or women. Okay. Like bonkers stuff. Right. So you see this crazy stuff going on and you say, I know why that's happening, because they're cheating. Right. The party no longer belongs to the people. And you can see this in real time with the Democrat Party, where the Democrat Party, how do I know they're cheating? Because they ditched their voters, right? Their voters were Rust Belt union guys, inner city mothers, who want to be able to walk to church in Harlem without getting shot. That is their base. It's been their base for 100 years. They walked away from it. How do I know Republicans aren't cheating? Because they did the exact opposite. They've been, reaching across the aisles. They've been, trying to appeal to Hispanic voters. They've been trying to appeal to union guys, which worked. Actually, the Hispanic voter thing worked, although not.
That was actually the easiest, because most Hispanics are really based.
Yeah,
ultimately, at the end of the day,
which is fascinating. I mean, this is the great irony, because Democrats imported these guys to be reliable Democrat voters, and it ain't working. And now, the next front here, I think, is going to be the cities. This law and order thing. I want Trump to stick with that. I want him to go Bukele hard on this. By the way, we've had presidents who've suspended habeas corpus, meaning mass roundups and no trials. So there's actually a lot of constitutional room in there if he wants to go that direction.
I'll say that what they're doing right now is they're actually setting Trump up to become Lincoln, so that they can choose to then say, well, we need to secede from this guy. That's what they're clearly planning. That's what Gavin Newsom is doing out in California. That's what they're doing in New York. That's what they're doing in New York. I mean, it's really, really obvious to me what their plan is. That's why they installed Mark Carney in Canada to be an oppositional, to be a classic oppositional force in Canada against the United States. Meanwhile, all the cartel drug money is being laundered, be it Chinese or CIA or Mexican or whatever. It's all being laundered through Canadian banks. We know this. It's a big deal. All of this is a big deal. So we have to start treating these people like hostile actors.
Yeah.
And not like people that we actually share a country with. We need to be looking at them that way. And this is where, everybody's kind of libertarian fifis need to, be dealt with in therapy for a little while. At times you have to just stand up and say, that's enough. Enough is enough. And we're doing this. And then we will deal with the consequences of, quote unquote, violating people's non-aggression principle rights or whatever afterwards. But when you're at war, you fight the war to win. You don't fight the war with your morals intact. Sorry, it just doesn't work that way. You have to at some point say, I am willing to do X, Y, and Z to get these things done, because in the long run, this will be better for everybody. And then we can fix the overcorrections afterwards, which is what happened, after Reconstruction.
Yeah,
in many ways.
Right. And, the game they've been playing is that their guy drives a truck through the Constitution, whether it's FDR, Wilson, Lincoln. I'm taking Lincoln as a left winger here. They drive a truck through the Constitution, and then we have to do the whole be better, follow the rules. The Marquess of Queensberry rules on the way back. So, when they complain, for example, if they have some ridiculous court decision that they lay on Trump, ignore it. Why? Because that's what FDR did. If they would like to cut a deal where we're going to vacate every single thing FDR did, I'll take that deal, and then I'll tell Trump, you got to behave now, guy. But until that day, no, we got to do what we got to do at self-defense.
Yeah, no, I agreed. And it's ultimately, it's a very simple self-defense argument. And, and if that means, hey, and one of the things I really want him to repeal when this is all said and done is the Banking Act of 1935 and get us back to a reformed Fed that only backstops the commercial paper market. And enforces the international value of the dollar through the standing repo facility and the foreign repo facility, and interact with foreign central banks, and the Treasury can take care of the rest of it, and the domestic commercial banking system can deal with itself. We have a debt indexing rate to figure out what the cost of dollars is internally. We don't need to know what the cost of dollars should be in Malaysia. We don't give a shit, or City of London, or Luxembourg, or Zurich, or anywhere else. Fuck these people. This is about Minneapolis. This is about taking Minneapolis back from the IQ-60 Somalis that Barack Obama and the zip code targeted to take Minnesota. Fuck that. Enough. I'm over. Done. I don't care. Deport all these people. I'm at that point.
Yep.
And it has to be done. And you put that you like at the end of the day, we're being bullied into being good guys.
Yes.
Into being nice guys.
Right.
No, I'm not going to be. I'm not going to be bullied into being a nice guy. Get the fuck out of my country.
Yeah.
Like, that's enough.
And, what's incomprehensible to me, all right, so I spent about 20 years as an immigrant. I was an immigrant in Mexico, Canada, Taiwan, Japan. And throughout this, so like, of course, I was always a legal immigrant. And so like when I'm living in Taiwan, if a bunch of criminal like Russians are sneaking into the country as illegal immigrants, I want them out. I'm not some like what I'm going to support them because like we're all white. That's a disgusting notion, right? I want them out because they're bringing my brand down. Right? Everybody's going to look at me like I get criminal Russian now, so I want them out for that alone.
There you go.
But they're dangerous people. They victimize people. They victimize Taiwanese. They would victimize me. So I want these people out. So like the sort of Democrat default where like if you're Hispanic, you got to support illegal. What? And that's why I think, Trump got 55% of Hispanic males. Like he is the choice of Hispanic male. Hispanic males are Donald Trump supporters at this point. And I think that's the reason why, because, the main victims of illegal immigrants are legal immigrants. They're competing for the same jobs. Yes. They're living in the same neighborhoods. Their daughters are dating these guys. Right. There's a lot of social fallout from these characters. And God bless, Democrats went so crazy. They got so wrapped up in this whole tick the box, they lost sight of it. And, if from here on out, if Democrats or rather Hispanics are actually going to trend, towards Republicans, if Trump succeeds on this law and order thing and starts to win back urban whites, at least he got 25% of black males. I mean, like it's not impossible. And, I grew up in a part of Philly that was right next to the hood. I know people in this neighborhood, no matter what race they are, they really want more police. They all want more police. They see a white guy move into the neighborhood and they're like, thank God there's white people. Now we're going to have police at last. Police are finally going to come when we call them, right? I mean, it's just right. And like at some point I got to wonder, like, do Democrats talk to their voters? Trump intuitively understands. He understands what black voters want, what Hispanic voters. He's like the Steve Jobs of politics, right? Steve Jobs' genius was that he could see what you want when you didn't even know that you wanted it, right? You wanted the Jesus phone for $800. You didn't think you wanted it, right? When it first came out, everybody was like, you got to be kidding. By the way, that phone, the iPhone, came out $800. It was like 5 times the cost of any other phone. Came out on the eve of the 2008 crisis. Worst timing in history. Most successful product in history. Why? Because he knew what you want. Donald Trump knows that. Democrats instead, I think what's happening is that they spend so much time with the freaks or with the university focus or what do you call it, faculty meetings. They don't actually know what their voters want. So if, sort of wrapping that up, right, if this is a sort of Carter-like mini crisis where people, the voters woke up, they revolted, which it feels like, right? We have kind of this tide turning, like almost to the minute that Trump took office and all this woke crap. If we're at that moment, and then if you've got these structural changes where, the Midwest at an absolute minimum is purple, it may well be red at this point, even like Minnesota, the parts that aren't Somali. So, he seems to have won on the Midwest, which is a big part of the Democrat coalition. He seems to have won over Hispanics, which is another big chunk of the coalition. That was really where they were putting all their marbles. They were trying to grow that. And then, if like cities can become competitive, I think, the Democrat Party at that point is in free fall. Hopefully it goes back to the drawing board, tries to become a sane party, maybe something closer to Bill Clinton, which was not that bad in the grand scheme. And at that point, we have a two-party system again. I think there's a good chance of that. I think in the election, Trump lost New Jersey by something like 5 points. It's New Jersey.
Yeah, which is insane.
Yeah, that's like this
New
close to a
Jersey, I
swing
know.
state. So I think the trend is
Yes.
good.
No, the trend is very, very good. And I noted all that. So New Jersey was in some ways, it wasn't ever in play per se, but it was in more in play than it ever was.
Yeah.
Oh, and he's cleaning out Virginia.
Yeah.
Okay, which outside of Loudoun, Fairfax counties is deep red
Yep.
as well.
Yep.
Now he's cleaning out. Now he's cleaning out Virginia, and he's and Cospedal is dispersing half of those people around the country and putting them in different places. Like that, it's happening. Like you start cutting all those people out of the system, and they're no longer gaining. Again, go back to my statement about excessive margins. These are people that are bureaucrats pulling down government salaries and living lifestyles that they have no business. Like no business maintaining. No, you got to go back and start working for 15% gross margins like the rest of us are.
Yeah.
As that's what we're doing. And you don't get to live on our dime anymore. But hey, we're also going to bring a lot of jobs back to this country. We're going to get rid of the people that are stealing those jobs and making our highways unsafe and all the rest of it. Like this is what has to happen. And it's not an easy task, but the thing that I think should make us feel actually quite good about this is how well he did with the young people,
Yeah,
especially young males.
Yeah.
And that's where the opportunities lie. I've told this story before and I'll tell it again. Like one day my daughter came to me right after she got her first job, which it happens to be, doing some, relatively important work, entry level work over at the University of Florida. But and then she heard about how much, like welders make. Again, back to the micro point, and we had talked, and it's not like it's not like the micro TED talk isn't on like permanent, like it's not like permanently, running in the background of my house. If you've not seen the micro TED talk, folks, and you must, Anagnorisis and Peripatia it's brilliant. But like it's not like she didn't know this stuff, but then when she finally saw it, like a friend of hers like entered into the trade program and it's making like 90 grand or 100 grand a year, and she's like, I can do that. I'm like, yeah, you could if you really wanted to. My point is those are the jobs that generate the real wealth. You want this, if Wall Street wants their AI revolution to turn us into, to suck up all the power, we're going to have to lay an awful lot of copper.
Yeah.
And we don't produce a lot of copper. And that means that there's a whole lot of jobs out there for the copper industry and the aluminum industry. And there ain't no way to get around that with robots. There ain't no way to get around that by having, there ain't. You're going to have to just go and get this stuff done. And it's real and it's durable. And the small businesses, the small contractor groups that are out there are, they're your growth industry. And, I was talking to a friend of mine the other day who's an electrician, and he's like, yeah, the business at this point, I have the ability to turn to like boomers who I know aren't going to make any, who are going to pay me whatever. And I can just add another, $2,500 to the bill. And he's like, but at the same point, I've got enough of those now that now I need to train someone. I'm like, and he can't find anybody to train. Yeah. Right. So then it's getting, so these are all good signs. So like, this is the world that he's trying to affect. And then, if we stop, my point always, Peter, is that, we can get caught up in whatever it is whatever it is that we think we should be focusing on. But, said it many times in the last few months, the 5 most important words ever spoken in a film ever was in the generally terrible episode 1, The Phantom Menace. Your focus determines your reality. If you only focus on the debt and you don't focus on the assets, you're not looking at the entire company. You're not looking at you're not doing the entire analysis. So, I mean, what I'm asking people to do, and what I ask guests to do when they come on, is to sit there and literally challenge, what is your focus? And, what do you think, and, go away with a different set of parameters to the boundary conditions of the problem and see if you can come up with different boundary conditions that solve the problem differently. And if we all do that within the commentariat, it's going to be amazing how quickly the zeitgeist changes, because we affect what goes on Capitol Hill. We are the new media. And if we all parrot the same points about debt and deficits and everything else, and don't try and figure out what it is they're actually trying to do, then we're not giving them, and then steelman those arguments that guys like Bessent and Trump and the rest of them are making. We absolutely should be doing that. Don't get me wrong. Like that's our real value as commentators in this space, and that's what I try to structure each one of these podcasts when I bring somebody on to discuss them. This is why I don't do a lot of podcasts. I do 4 or 5 a month as opposed to one every freaking day. So, which, I mean, don't get me wrong. That's not a dig at your business model. I think your business model is brilliant.
Oh,
by the way.
My God.
To do a short video every day on a particular topic, one is incredibly difficult. Don't get me wrong. And I don't have the stamina for it.
Yeah.
But I appreciate that you do, and the way you do it, I think is incredibly valuable. I really, really do. And so, I wish you nothing but the best of fortune with that business model. It's a different business model than mine,
for sure.
But
yeah.
Yeah.
No, yeah. If I did long things like you, there's no way. I am 52. I don't have the. Maybe if I were 25, but who knows? But the point you're making, right, that to focus on the opportunities, 100%, it's critical. And there is so much happening right now in terms of opportunities, right? Start with the AI and the robots. All right, media loves this narrative that it's going to be disaster. We're all going to be eating cat food. Absolutely not. That is not how any automation worked. All right, when farming came in, right, it took away all the hunter-gatherer jobs. When fire came in, it took away, I don't know what job that took away, digesting flesh. When every new technology, it wipes out the old jobs and it replaces them with new jobs that pay better. And this has been true for thousands of years. Aristotle in ancient Greece worried that oxen were going to take away all the agricultural jobs. And then you'd have all these agricultural workers that had nothing to do. In medieval Europe, they worried about water mills. Right, on streams and windmills. Those were going to take away all the jobs, and nobody was going to have any jobs. All right, it's goofy. The industrialization of agriculture, right? Another one. So in the space of 30 years, something like half of jobs in the U.S. starting in 1880 or so vanished. What happened? Wow, we discovered new things, right? Because human wants are endless, right? There are services, there's repairing stuff, there's consider that vending machines have existed for over 100 years, yet people go to bartenders, right? Bartenders are more expensive. Bartenders are different than a vending machine. People go out to dinner, even though we have robots that make food and put it in packages at Walmart. Okay. So anyway, but the point is that whenever in economics, whenever you have some change that adjusts the prices, the relative prices, that it's like I don't know, if you're like a kid and you're looking for a crawfish in the creek and you pick up a rock and you get all these juicy little ones, right? That's where the good stuff is. When a price changes, you have enormous opportunity. Right now, we have 4 big changes happening. We have the automation starting with AI, which is going to hit white collars first, not going to hit blue collars, right? Robots,
absolutely.
Yeah, robots are probably about 10 years after that. You have the illegals, where all these blue collar jobs are now being opened up, and now they actually have to pay living wages. Right, so they fire the illegals in Nebraska at the meatpacking factory making $7 an hour. Now they got to hire at 30. Huge opportunity. You have the tariffs, right? Which when you combine the tariffs with the robots, right? So the robots and the AI remove the benefits of cheap labor, right? So those actually give you a massive playing field advantage versus the China and the Vietnams that have been stealing the jobs. And then you've got deregulation, right? Which takes the boot off the neck of startups. This right now, you take all those factors together, this, maybe the 1990s with the internet comes close, but this is the entrepreneurial moment of our lifetimes. There is so much opportunity right now, but you have to take it, right? You have to keep an eye out. You have to ask yourself, what can I do for other people? What can I do for them that's so valuable to them that they'll give me money for it? Okay, that could be fixing screens. I live in Florida. Everybody's always got busted screens. You can look on YouTube. You can learn that in 3 minutes, how to fix a screen. You got a little spline. All right, figure out some service. You are going to make much more than you do today, because the metaphor I use is that automation is like an escalator. The escalator moves us up, makes us richer, but every so often you got to take a step down for the automation. You got to do that with the internet, for example. There were a lot of industries that got wiped out by the internet. Nobody makes maps anymore. I used to use a media clipping service back in the early 90s where they would look for your company's name. That's gone now, right? It's a Google alert. Lots of jobs got got nuked. And guess what? The new jobs pay better. So yes, well, 100%, that's what people should be focusing on. It's good to talk about the threats, to talk about Ukraine and tax rates and deficits and things. But fundamentally, 99% of all of these factors are under your control, depending on what you focus on.
I agree. SWOT, well, the first thing we do when we look at a company: strengths, weaknesses, opportunities, and threats. Don't just focus on the threats, folks. Don't just focus on the weaknesses. That's what they want you to focus on. That's the story that they're telling you on a daily basis, because they're making money by you focusing on the negatives as opposed to your opportunities. That is the key. So no, Peter, thank you very, very much for that. That was a perfect way to end this podcast. At times a little contentious, which is what I hope for every time I do one of these. So I enjoy having people push back on some of my bullshit, and I appreciate it. So with that said, you have a hard stop. I have a hard stop. Why don't we pull it? We'll pick it up in a few more months, and we'll do it again.
Great. Looking forward, Tom. Thank you.
So, give everybody a shameless plug on the way out the door. Let's wrap this thing up.
I make daily videos, 3.5 minutes long, so you can't get bored, talking about economics and freedom. Those are up on X. And then follow me at Prof St.Onge, ProfStonge.
Okay, there you go. Peter St.Onge, thank you very, very much. And you guys, I'm Tom, he's Pete, I'm TFL 1728. Keep your stick on the ice.